You know this loop, the mind that refuses to stop. One thought becoming 5, 5 becoming 50. A conversation from 3 days ago suddenly replaying at 2 in the morning. A future scenario that does not exist yet, but your body reacts to it as if it already happened. And the strange part is, the more intelligent you are, the harder the loop becomes to escape, because your mind keeps convincing you that more thinking will finally produce relief. One more analysis, one more conclusion, one more attempt to solve the feeling internally. But instead, the thinking itself becomes the source of exhaustion. Carl Jung believed the human psyche was never designed to be ruled entirely by conscious thought. And modern nervous system research is beginning to arrive at a similar realization. That excessive thinking is often not a failure of intelligence, but a nervous system trapped in a state of unresolved alertness. Your thoughts are not simply thinking. They are trying to protect you, trying to predict, trying to control, trying to prevent pain before it arrives. But eventually, the mind becomes so overloaded that thinking no longer creates clarity, only noise. And the deeper problem is this: most people try to solve excessive thinking with more thinking, which is why the cycle almost never ends. Most people living inside excessive thinking believe the problem is mental. They believe they simply need more discipline, more clarity, more control over their thoughts. But the deeper someone enters the cycle, the more they begin noticing something strange. The thinking rarely produces resolution, only temporary relief. A person analyzes the situation repeatedly, and for a few moments anxiety decreases. Then the nervous system activates again. Another possibility appears, another fear, another uncertainty, and the mind immediately resumes its attempt to regain control. This is why excessive thinking feels addictive, because the brain mistakes analysis for safety. Carl Jung believed the conscious mind desperately tries to create certainty in order to protect the ego from uncertainty. But life itself remains fundamentally uncertain. Relationships change, people leave, identities collapse. The future refuses to become fully predictable. And the more someone fears uncertainty internally, the more compulsively the mind tries to eliminate it through thought. But thought cannot fully remove uncertainty. So the loop continues. Modern nervous system research describes something remarkably similar. When the nervous system perceives unresolved threat, the body enters a state of hypervigilance. Attention narrows. The mind scans constantly for danger. Future scenarios become exaggerated. Small emotional signals suddenly feel loaded with meaning. And the thinking mind begins trying to solve what is actually a physiological state. This is why someone can logically know they are safe, while their body still feels unsafe. The nervous system does not respond primarily to logic. It responds to perception, to emotional memory, to unresolved tension, to the feeling of danger. And once the body enters prolonged alertness, thought itself becomes distorted by survival energy. A person begins mentally rehearsing conversations before they happen, replaying old interactions repeatedly, analyzing subtle emotional details obsessively, trying to predict every possible outcome before reality arrives. Not because they are irrational, but because the nervous system believes constant anticipation might prevent future pain. And for highly intelligent people, this often becomes worse, because intelligence gives the mind more material to work with, more possibilities, more interpretations, more hypothetical futures, more psychological complexity. the intellect becomes extremely efficient at generating explanations, but terrible at creating peace. Jung observed this repeatedly in highly analytical individuals. The more disconnected someone became from instinct, intuition, embodiment, and emotional integration, the more tyrannical thought itself became, as if the mind slowly stopped serving the person, and the person began serving the mind. And this creates one of the cruelest paradoxes of excessive thinking. The individual believes thinking is protecting them, while the thinking itself is exhausting the nervous system continuously. The mind attempts to escape uncertainty, but its constant activity produces even more internal instability, which creates even more thinking. A feedback loop. Thought creating anxiety, anxiety creating thought. And over time, the person becomes psychologically trapped inside their own attempts to escape psychological discomfort. This is why telling someone to just stop thinking almost never works, because excessive thinking is rarely a voluntary habit. It is usually the surface expression of a nervous system that no longer feels safe enough to become still. And perhaps this explains why silence feels so uncomfortable for many people now. The moment external stimulation disappears, the internal noise becomes impossible to ignore. Thoughts surge forward immediately. Unfinished fears, unprocessed emotions, old memories, future catastrophes, identity anxiety, the psyche attempting to force unresolved material into awareness. But modern life provides endless methods of escape. Phones, noise, work, scrolling, constant stimulation. Anything to prevent direct contact with the internal state underneath the thinking. Jung believed modern human beings had become profoundly disconnected from the deeper layers of the psyche. And when the unconscious is ignored long enough, it does not disappear. It begins speaking through anxiety instead, through obsession, compulsion, restlessness, mental exhaustion, the psyche trying desperately to restore balance, while the conscious mind keeps trying to overpower it through more analysis. And eventually, thinking stops feeling like a tool and starts feeling like a prison. One of the most dangerous aspects of excessive thinking is that eventually it begins separating a person from direct experience itself. They stop living reality fully and begin living primarily inside interpretation. A moment happens, and immediately the mind starts analyzing it. What did that expression mean? Why did they say it like that? What if this becomes a problem later? What if I made the wrong decision? The experience itself disappears beneath layers of interpretation almost instantly. And over time, the individual slowly loses contact with the present moment entirely, not spiritually, physiologically, because the nervous system cannot fully regulate while the mind remains trapped in continuous anticipation. Stephen Porges, whose work on polyvagal theory transformed modern understanding of the nervous system, observed that human beings constantly move between states of safety, mobilization, and shutdown. And when the body no longer feels safe internally, the mind becomes hyperactive trying to compensate. Thought becomes surveillance, constant internal monitoring, the psyche searching endlessly for certainty before allowing itself to relax. But certainty never fully arrives. So the nervous system remains activated, and the body slowly forgets what genuine stillness feels like. This is why excessive thinkers often feel exhausted even when physically resting. The body may stop moving, while the nervous system never actually exits alertness. Jung understood this long before neuroscience had the language to describe it precisely. He believed modern consciousness had become dangerously over-identified with intellect. Human beings stopped listening to instinct, stopped listening to emotional signals, stopped listening to dreams, symbols, bodily intuition, unconscious perception. And gradually, thought positioned itself as the supreme authority inside the psyche. But Jung warned that the intellect is a useful servant and a dangerous master, because thought alone cannot regulate fear. It cannot create emotional safety. It cannot replace embodiment. And perhaps this explains why many highly analytical people secretly feel disconnected from themselves. Their entire identity becomes concentrated in the mind. Meanwhile, the body carries enormous amounts of unresolved tension underneath conscious awareness. Tight breathing, jaw tension, stomach contraction, chronic fatigue, hypervigilance, sleep disruption. The nervous system speaking a language the intellect keeps trying to override. But the more someone suppresses these signals, the louder the psyche eventually becomes. This is why anxiety often intensifies when someone finally slows down. The silence removes distraction, and suddenly the body begins surfacing everything the mind spent years trying to outthink. Old grief, fear, loneliness, identity instability, unprocessed emotional memory, the psyche demanding attention, not punishment, not weakness, attention. And this creates another misunderstanding around excessive thinking. People assume the goal is to eliminate thought completely. But Jung never believed consciousness should destroy the intellect. The goal was integration, restoring balance between thinking and deeper forms of knowing. Because in both Jungian psychology and ancient contemplative traditions, thought was never considered the highest faculty of consciousness. Only one faculty among many. The Hermetic traditions described something called nous, a form of direct knowing deeper than discursive thought, an intelligence not based in constant mental analysis, but in perception itself. Modern psychology sometimes approaches a similar idea through intuition, somatic awareness, or unconscious pattern recognition. Different language, same phenomenon. The body often perceives reality long before conscious thought explains it. But excessive thinking interrupts this relationship continuously. The mind becomes so loud that subtler forms of perception can no longer be heard clearly, and eventually, the individual loses trust in every form of knowing except analysis. They stop listening inwardly, stop feeling directly, stop sensing intuitively. Everything must now pass through the intellect first, and this creates profound internal fragmentation, because the psyche contains far more than conscious thought alone: emotion, instinct, symbol, dream, desire, fear, intuition, imagination. The unconscious constantly attempting communication beneath ordinary awareness. But excessive thinking turns consciousness into a dictatorship. The intellect trying to dominate every other voice inside the psyche. And eventually, the entire inner world becomes exhausted from the effort. Excessive thinking is rarely only about thinking. At its deepest level, it is usually about control. The mind becomes obsessed with predicting reality because prediction creates the illusion of safety. If I can anticipate everything, maybe I can avoid pain. If I analyze every possibility, maybe I can prevent rejection. If I think hard enough, maybe uncertainty will finally disappear. But uncertainty never disappears completely, which means the mind never receives permission to stop. Carl Jung believed the ego suffers profoundly when it realizes life cannot be fully controlled consciously. Because the ego wants stability, predictability, orientation, a coherent narrative explaining reality clearly enough to feel psychologically secure. But existence itself refuses to cooperate with that demand. People change unexpectedly. Relationships collapse without warning. Meaning disappears and returns unpredictably. The future remains partially unknowable no matter how intelligent someone becomes. And for individuals deeply identified with intellect, this becomes terrifying. Because the mind keeps trying to solve what cannot fully be solved mentally. Jung believed this was one of the great psychological crises of modern consciousness. Human beings had become disconnected from mystery, disconnected from uncertainty, disconnected from the deeper unconscious intelligence operating beneath conscious control. Modern culture worships mastery, optimization, control, productivity, constant certainty. But psychologically, human beings remain profoundly vulnerable creatures living inside an uncertain reality. And the nervous system knows this, which is why the body often reacts long before conscious thought understands why. A subtle tension enters the stomach. The chest tightens. Breathing changes. The body sensing instability before the intellect explains it. But excessive thinkers often distrust these signals. They attempt to override them with analysis. The mind immediately begins searching for explanations, categorizing, interpreting, forecasting, preparing, as if enough thinking might eventually eliminate vulnerability itself. But vulnerability is not a design flaw in human existence. It is part of being conscious. And perhaps this is why excessive thinking becomes so exhausting over time. The individual is unconsciously trying to achieve something psychologically impossible. Permanent certainty, permanent control, permanent emotional protection. But life continuously destabilizes these fantasies, which forces the mind to work even harder trying to rebuild them again. This creates enormous nervous system fatigue, because the body remains trapped between two impossible demands. The psyche wants rest, but the ego refuses to release control. And eventually, thinking becomes compulsive not because it works, but because stopping feels dangerous. Silence begins feeling threatening. Stillness becomes uncomfortable. The absence of mental activity creates anxiety instead of peace. Because once thought slows down, the individual finally encounters the emotional state underneath the thinking itself. Fear, grief, loneliness, shame, emptiness, uncertainty. The very experiences the mind was trying to outmaneuver all along. Jung observed that many people remain trapped in excessive intellectualization precisely because feeling directly feels too vulnerable psychologically. Thought creates distance. Analysis creates control. But emotional reality cannot be fully resolved from a distance. At some point, the psyche demands direct contact. Not more interpretation, not more explanation. Contact. And this is where modern culture becomes especially dangerous. Because distraction now exists everywhere. Constant stimulation allows the intellect to remain active almost continuously. Phones, streaming, scrolling, information, productivity, noise. The nervous system rarely receives enough silence to complete emotional processing naturally. So, unresolved psychological material accumulates internally. And eventually the mind begins circling around it endlessly, trying to solve emotionally what actually requires presence. This is why many highly intelligent people secretly feel trapped inside themselves. Their intellect became overdeveloped, while their relationship to stillness, embodiment, intuition, and emotional tolerance remained fragile. The mind became powerful, but the inner world became ungrounded. And perhaps this is the deeper tragedy of excessive thinking. The person is not failing because they think too little. They are suffering because thought has become disconnected from the deeper intelligence of the psyche itself. And once the intellect loses contact with that deeper ground, it begins consuming itself endlessly in search of certainty it can never fully reach. So how does someone actually begin breaking excessive thinking? Not suppressing it, not fighting it, breaking the cycle itself. Jung believed the psyche cannot be forced into balance through aggression toward oneself, because the more violently someone fights the mind, the more conflict the nervous system perceives internally, which usually produces even more mental activity. This is why excessive thinkers often become trapped in endless self-correction, trying to control thought with more thought, trying to force calmness through analysis, trying to think their way into peace. But the first real shift begins when someone understands something profoundly important. The nervous system does not calm down because it is intellectually convinced. It calms down when it experiences safety directly, physiologically, emotionally, somatically. This is why many people experience temporary relief during very ordinary moments. Walking slowly at night, hearing rain, touching warm water, breathing deeply without effort, watching sunlight move across a room silently. For a brief moment, the nervous system stops preparing for danger, and the mind becomes quieter automatically, not because thought was defeated, because the body stopped signaling threat. Stephen Porges' research into nervous system regulation suggests that human beings constantly scan their environment for cues of safety or danger beneath conscious awareness. This process happens automatically. The body asks continuously, "Am I safe enough to relax?" And if the answer remains no, thought accelerates, preparation increases, hypervigilance intensifies. The psyche attempting to prevent future pain before it arrives. This is why intellectual insight alone rarely resolves excessive thinking. A person may fully understand their anxiety logically, while their nervous system still behaves as if danger remains present. The body does not automatically obey cognition. It responds to experience, and this changes the entire approach to healing excessive thinking. Because the goal is no longer how do I stop thoughts? The real question becomes, how do I help the nervous system experience enough safety to stop generating survival-driven thinking continuously? And this is where many ancient contemplative traditions become psychologically interesting, not because they were anti-thinking, but because they understood something modern culture forgot. Stillness changes consciousness. Breath changes consciousness. Attention changes nervous system state. The body and psyche constantly influence each other. This is why practices involving slow breathing, silence, repetitive movement, prayer, meditation, chanting, or contemplative walking appear across civilizations repeatedly. Different cultures discovered similar truths through different language, that human beings cannot think themselves into regulation indefinitely. At some point, the body must participate, and perhaps this explains why excessive thinkers often feel temporarily transformed by experiences where thought finally loosens its grip naturally. Nature, music, art, deep conversation, intimacy, certain dreams, moments of awe, experiences where the nervous system briefly exits defensive anticipation, and for a few seconds, life feels real again, direct, unfiltered, not trapped behind constant mental commentary. Jung believed these moments were profoundly important because they reminded the individual that consciousness exists beyond compulsive analysis, that the psyche contains deeper organizing intelligence beneath ordinary thought. But modern people often miss these openings completely. The moment silence appears, they reach for stimulation again. The moment uncertainty appears, thought rushes back in to restore control, the cycle restarting automatically. This is why breaking excessive thinking requires something much deeper than productivity techniques or positive affirmations. It requires retraining the relationship between mind, body, and consciousness itself. Teaching the nervous system that not every unknown future represents danger. Teaching the psyche that uncertainty can be survived. Teaching the intellect that it does not need to dominate every inner experience continuously. And this process begins very quietly, not through force, but through repeated moments where the body slowly relearns what safety actually feels like again. But eventually, another realization begins emerging. Excessive thinking is not only exhausting because the mind is overactive, it is exhausting because the individual slowly loses trust in every form of knowing except analysis. The intellect becomes the sole authority inside the psyche. Every decision must be justified mentally. Every feeling must be explained. Every uncertainty must become cognitively manageable before action feels safe. And over time, the person stops listening inwardly altogether. Carl Jung believed this was one of the deepest imbalances of modern consciousness. The conscious mind became overdeveloped, while intuition, instinct, symbolic perception, and unconscious intelligence became increasingly ignored. But the psyche never stops communicating, even when the intellect dominates awareness completely. It speaks through dreams, through emotional reactions, through bodily tension, through synchronicities, through sudden intuitions arriving before rational explanation, and often through exhaustion itself. The psyche attempting to force the individual to slow down enough to hear what conscious thought keeps interrupting. Jung believed intuition was not irrationality. It was another mode of perception entirely. A way consciousness detects patterns before logical thought fully organizes them into language. Modern psychology sometimes approaches similar ideas through unconscious processing or somatic intuition. Different language, same phenomenon. The body and unconscious mind constantly perceive more information than conscious awareness can process immediately. But excessive thinkers frequently distrust these perceptions. If something cannot be explained instantly, the intellect dismisses it, and this creates profound fragmentation internally. Because the psyche contains forms of intelligence that do not communicate through linear reasoning alone. A dream may reveal emotional truth symbolically before the conscious mind accepts it rationally. The body may recognize danger before logic identifies evidence. An intuition may emerge long before conscious understanding catches up. But modern people are trained to trust only what can be analyzed verbally. Everything else feels suspicious, unreliable, too abstract. And yet, many of the most important experiences in human life arrive precisely through forms of knowing that exceed rational explanation. Love, meaning, beauty, grief, awe, spiritual experience, creative insight. None of these emerge through analysis alone. They are encountered directly, felt, lived, perceived. This is why many ancient traditions positioned intellect beneath deeper forms of awareness rather than above them. The Hermetic traditions described a distinction between discursive thinking and something called nous, a deeper intuitive intelligence capable of perceiving truth directly without endless mental processing. Not magical thinking, not fantasy. Direct inner perception. The intellect was meant to serve this deeper awareness, not replace it. But modern consciousness inverted the hierarchy. Now the intellect attempts to dominate every aspect of inner life continuously, and excessive thinking becomes the result. The mind trying to solve existential uncertainty using a tool never designed for total psychological control. This is why one of the most important shifts in healing excessive thinking involves learning to tolerate not knowing immediately, to pause before compulsive analysis begins, to allow bodily perception, emotional awareness, intuition, and silence to exist without immediate interpretation. At first, this feels terrifying because the ego experiences uncertainty as vulnerability. The mind immediately wants explanation again, prediction, narrative, control. But slowly, something unexpected begins happening. The individual realizes awareness still exists, even when thought quiets down. Consciousness itself remains present. Perception remains present. Reality remains present. And for the first time in a long time, the psyche begins breathing again beneath the noise of constant analysis. This does not mean abandoning reason. Jung never argued for irrationality. The intellect remains essential, but no longer tyrannical, no longer forced to carry responsibilities it was never designed to hold alone. And perhaps this is the deeper meaning of intuitive authority, not replacing thought with blind feeling, but restoring balance inside the psyche itself, allowing consciousness to become larger than compulsive analysis, larger than fear, larger than the endless attempt to mentally secure an uncertain world. Because eventually, healing excessive thinking is not about becoming less intelligent. It is about becoming capable of trusting reality again without needing to control every part of it cognitively. Eventually, excessive thinking brings many people to a breaking point, not because they become incapable of thinking, but because they become exhausted from carrying consciousness incorrectly for too long. The intellect was never designed to hold total responsibility for existence, and yet modern people ask the mind to do exactly that: predict the future, prevent pain, maintain identity, control uncertainty, guarantee emotional safety. The burden becomes impossible eventually. And this is where something deeper begins emerging. Not defeat, surrender, but not passive surrender. Not hopelessness, not resignation. A conscious release of the illusion that life can be fully controlled mentally. Jung believed every process of psychological transformation eventually requires a symbolic death, the collapse of an old relationship to identity, an old way of organizing reality, an old illusion of control. Alchemy described this stage as nigredo, the dark phase, a psychological dissolution where certainty breaks apart before deeper integration becomes possible. And for excessive thinkers, this stage often arrives when the mind finally realizes it cannot solve existence through analysis alone. At first, this realization feels terrifying, because the ego interprets surrender as danger. If I stop controlling, everything will collapse. If I stop analyzing, Something terrible will happen. If I stop mentally preparing, I will become vulnerable. But slowly, another possibility begins appearing. The individual notices that life continues moving even when thought relaxes its grip slightly. Breathing continues, reality continues, awareness continues. And for brief moments, the nervous system experiences something it has not felt in years. Rest. Not because uncertainty disappeared, but because consciousness stopped fighting uncertainty continuously. This is why many contemplative traditions described peace not as perfect control, but as a different relationship to uncertainty itself, a willingness to remain present without compulsively escaping into mental prediction. Jung believed the deeper self emerges precisely when the ego stops trying to dominate the psyche completely, not the destruction of individuality, but its reorganization around something deeper than fear. And perhaps this explains why genuine transformation often looks quieter than people expect. Less dramatic, less performative. A person simply stops arguing with reality constantly inside themselves, stops demanding immediate certainty, stops trying to mentally eliminate all vulnerability before allowing themselves to live. And slowly, the nervous system begins softening. The body releases tension it carried for years. The mind no longer needs to scan every future possibility continuously. Not because the person became unconscious, but because consciousness itself became more grounded, more embodied, more trusting. And this may be one of the most difficult truths modern people ever encounter. Healing does not always arrive through more effort. Sometimes it arrives through releasing the exhausting inner war entirely. And this is why excessive thinking often decreases not when someone finally finds the perfect answer, but when they stop demanding absolute certainty before allowing themselves peace. Because the psyche was never asking for perfect control. It was asking for safety, presence, integration, permission to exist without constant internal threat. And perhaps this is the real shift. The individual finally realizing they do not need to think themselves into worthiness, safety, or existence itself. They already exist before the thought appears. And if these explorations resonate with you, subscribe to the channel, because these videos are exploring something modern culture rarely teaches anymore: how consciousness, the nervous system, symbolism, psychology, and ancient wisdom intersect beneath ordinary human experience, and why so many modern struggles are not failures of intelligence, but signs that the psyche is trying to restore balance in a world that has forgotten how to become still. Perhaps the strangest part of healing excessive thinking is realizing that life was never asking for constant mental control in the first place, only presence. But modern people rarely experience presence anymore. The mind keeps pulling consciousness away from direct experience continuously, into prediction, into replay, into anticipation, into imagined futures that never fully arrive. And eventually, a person can spend years living inside thought without fully inhabiting their own life. Carl Jung believed modern consciousness had become profoundly imbalanced. Human beings learned how to analyze reality, but forgot how to experience it directly, forgot how to listen inwardly, forgot how to remain psychologically present without compulsive interpretation. And perhaps this is why silence feels so uncomfortable now. Because silence removes distraction. It reveals the internal state underneath performance, the unresolved emotions beneath productivity, The fear beneath constant stimulation, the exhaustion beneath endless mental activity. But slowly, if someone remains present long enough without escaping immediately into thought again, something unexpected begins happening. The nervous system softens, breathing changes, the body stops preparing for catastrophe continuously, and awareness becomes quieter without becoming unconscious. Not empty, not numb, alive, direct. Reality begins feeling less filtered through fear, less filtered through endless anticipation, more immediate, more human. And perhaps this is what excessive thinkers were truly searching for the entire time. Not perfect certainty, not complete control. Peace. A nervous system no longer trapped in constant preparation against life itself. Jung once wrote that people will do almost anything to avoid facing their own souls. And maybe excessive thinking is sometimes part of that avoidance. The intellect moving endlessly, so the deeper emotional reality underneath never has to be encountered directly. But eventually, the psyche becomes too exhausted to continue the performance forever. And this is where transformation quietly begins. Not through forcing thought to disappear, but through learning that awareness exists beneath thought itself. A deeper stillness already present underneath the noise. And once someone experiences that directly, even briefly, their relationship to thinking changes forever, because they finally realize something the mind could never think its way toward. Consciousness was never meant to live entirely inside fear, and life was never meant to be experienced only through analysis. At some point, the psyche asks to be lived, not endlessly interpreted. And after that realization, thinking no longer feels like identity, only a tool, one voice inside a much larger inner world.